In the early hours of June 17, 1972, the first sign was not a confession, not a memo, not a tape from inside the White House. It was a strip of tape on a door. The place was the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., a large modern development near the Potomac River. Inside it, after midnight, the public life of the city had thinned out. Offices were dark. Corridors were quieter. The kind of night work that keeps a building running had passed mostly to people who were supposed to notice small irregularities, a light left on, a door out of place, a lock that did not behave as it should. One of those people was Frank Wills. Wills was a night security guard at the Watergate. He was working the midnight to 7 a.m. shift, the kind of shift that asks for patience more than drama. The Washington Post later reported that he was earning $80 a week. His job was not to investigate national politics. It was to make rounds, check the building, and respond when something appeared wrong. During that shift, something did. Wills noticed tape on a stairwell or exit door lock. The point of the tape was simple and practical. If a door lock or latch was taped in the right way, the door could close without truly locking. Someone could pass through it later without a key. To anyone rushing by, the door might look ordinary. To a guard responsible for the building, it was a small failure in the system, a locked door that had been made to stop being locked. Wills removed the tape. That detail matters because of how ordinary it was. He did not discover a broken safe. He did not find men in masks. He did not uncover a plan. He found a door that had been tampered with and restored it to what it was supposed to be, a locked door. Then, later, he saw that the tape had reappeared. That second look changed the meaning of the first one. A single piece of tape could be carelessness, a maintenance shortcut, or an unexplained mistake. Tape appearing again after it had been removed suggested intent. Someone had noticed the problem had been corrected, and someone had undone the correction. The door would not stay locked because someone inside or moving through the building wanted it that way. In Wills's security log, the wording preserved from that night included a 1:47 a.m. entry about finding tape on doors and calling police to inspect. The sentence is spare, almost bureaucratic. It does not sound like the opening line of a constitutional crisis. But in retrospect, it is one of the most important routine entries in modern American political history. The call went out to police. At that moment, the event still belonged to the world of building security and criminal trespass. A guard had found tampered locks. Police were being asked to inspect. Nothing about that call, by itself, proved that the Democratic National Committee was involved. Nothing about it proved that a presidential campaign had a connection. Nothing about it pointed yet toward Senate hearings, subpoena battles, secret recordings, impeachment articles, or a resignation. But the mechanism of Watergate began there, a physical clue, a second observation, and a decision to report it. The location would soon matter. The break-in occurred at the Democratic National Committee offices inside the Watergate office complex. Washington Post reporting identified those offices as being on the 6th floor. In the hours after Wills's discovery, police would arrest 5 men inside those offices. Their names would become part of the first layer of the record: James McCord, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. But before the names, before the equipment, before the political links, there was the strange behavior of a door. This is one reason the Watergate break-in has endured as a mystery as well as a scandal. Its beginning was almost too small for the consequences that followed. American history often remembers Watergate through the later images: senators at microphones, witnesses under oath, the phrase executive privilege, the hidden recording system in the White House, and President Richard Nixon's final departure from office. Those later events were enormous. They reshaped the limits of presidential power and the public's understanding of political accountability. Yet the first reliable clue was something a person could touch: tape. Not a theory, not a rumor, not a partisan accusation. A material sign that a secure route through a building had been altered. That is what gives the opening hours of June 17th their quiet force. A burglary is usually understood as an intrusion into property. Watergate began that way too, an illegal entry into offices in the middle of the night. But the place entered was not just any office. It was the headquarters of a national political party during a presidential election year. Once the police response began, the question was no longer only who had come through the door. It was why they had come, what they were carrying, and who, if anyone, had sent them. Wills could not have known the scale of what would follow. No one standing in that corridor could have seen the full path ahead. On the day of the break-in, the FBI would be alerted. Acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray would be notified by teletype that one of the arrested men was connected to the committee to re-elect the president. That fact would later become one of the earliest political shocks in the case. But at the instant Wills made his report, the story had not yet become a national investigation. It was still local, still physical, still contained by walls, doors, stairwells, and offices. That containment did not last. The most important investigations often begin when something ordinary refuses to fit. Here, the ordinary object was a door lock. The refusal was literal. It would not stay locked. Somebody had interfered with it, and when the interference was removed, somebody put it back. In an archive report story, this is the kind of detail that deserves to be slowed down, not because the tape itself explains Watergate, but because it shows how the first thread was found. The later scandal would involve institutions at the highest levels of American government: the White House, the FBI, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the presidency itself. But the first thread did not come from any of those places. It came from a night guard doing his rounds in a private office complex. The contrast is essential. On one side, there is the vast machinery that Watergate eventually exposed: political espionage, campaign money, obstruction of justice, secret White House recordings, and the question of whether a president could withhold evidence from a criminal proceeding. On the other side, there is Frank Wills working overnight, noticing tape where tape did not belong. The scandal's later power can make the opening scene feel inevitable, as if history was already moving toward Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974. But on June 17, 1972, nothing was inevitable. If the tape had not been noticed, if it had not been removed, if its return had not seemed suspicious, if police had not been called, the break-in might have followed a different course, at least for a time. Instead, the door became evidence. It established that someone had prepared a route. It showed that the entry was not random. It gave police a reason to enter the situation while the burglars were still inside. And because the offices belonged to the Democratic National Committee, that reason quickly pulled law enforcement into the center of a presidential campaign season. The Watergate story is often told as a tale of power: who held it, who abused it, and who tried to conceal the abuse. But its first chapter is also a tale of attention. Wills noticed a small thing, then noticed that the small thing had happened again. In the middle of the night, inside a building designed for offices, residences, hotel rooms, shops, and public life, a simple lock became the boundary between secrecy and exposure. That building would soon lend its name to the entire scandal. Watergate would stop being only an address near the Potomac River and become a word Americans used for a crisis of government itself. But before the name became shorthand, before the complex became inseparable from the scandal, it was a real place with real doors, real corridors, and a night guard making his rounds. The name came later to mean scandal. At first, it meant a place. Watergate was not a code word when Frank Wills made his rounds. It was not yet a suffix that would be attached to other political controversies. It was a complex of buildings on Virginia Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C., close to the Potomac River, close to the Kennedy Center, and close enough to the machinery of national politics that a crime inside one of its offices could not remain ordinary for long. The official address listed for the complex by the Commission of Fine Arts is 2500 Virginia Avenue Northwest. That address matters because Watergate was not hidden on the edge of the Capitol. It stood in a visible part of Washington, on land that had once been industrial, near the river, near cultural power, near government, and near the networks of people who moved between hotels, offices, apartments, campaigns, law firms, and federal institutions. In the public memory, Watergate can seem like a single building. The word has become so compressed by history that it is easy to picture one doorway, one office, one darkened hall. But the place itself was more complicated. It was a mixed-use development: hotel, office, retail, and residential space, combined into a single modern complex. People did not only work there, they stayed there. They lived there. They walked through shops and lobbies. They passed from private residence to public corridor, from commercial space to office floors, from the routines of daily life into the guarded quiet of late night. That mixture is part of why the break-in took hold so powerfully. A burglary inside an isolated warehouse would have carried a different meaning. A break-in at a campaign office in a multi-purpose building near the Potomac had another texture. The setting was ordinary enough to be believable and important enough to be alarming. It was not a fortress. It was a place designed for circulation. The Watergate complex was designed by Italian architect Luigi Moretti and built over a period stretching from 1963 to 1971. Those years placed the project in the Washington of the 1960s and early 1970s, a capital reshaping itself architecturally as well as politically. The complex rose on former industrial land along the Potomac River, turning a working riverside area into a development that combined luxury, commerce, offices, and residence. That transformation is important. Watergate was not merely a backdrop accidentally chosen by history. It represented a particular kind of urban ambition, a self-contained modern development where different forms of private and public life could coexist. There were hotel rooms for visitors. There were apartments for residents. There were retail areas for daily commerce. There were offices for organizations, law firms, associations, and political operations. This meant that after dark, the building did not simply empty in the way a single-purpose office block might. It shifted states. The daytime office population thinned, but the hotel and residential parts remained alive in another rhythm. In that environment, a security guard's attention mattered. Doors, stairwells, locks, and corridors were not incidental details. They were the seams of the complex. They separated public movement from restricted space. They determined who could pass from one area to another after hours. A strip of tape on a lock meant that one of those seams had been deliberately weakened. The Democratic National Committee offices were inside this complex, and that fact would make the building inseparable from the scandal. The burglary was not remembered only by the name of the political office that was entered. It was remembered by the name of the place. Watergate became the container for the event, and then the word for everything that followed: the arrests, the investigations, the cover-up, the Senate hearings, the tapes, the court fight, the impeachment process, and the resignation of President Richard Nixon. But before that larger chain began, the name worked in a simpler way. It told investigators where to go. It told reporters where the police had made arrests. It told readers and viewers that this was not a vague accusation, but a specific crime scene. The physicality of the place anchored the story. There were photographs of the complex preserved among trial exhibits. There were rooms, doors, offices, hotel spaces, and objects that could be collected, examined, and entered into evidence. The scandal that later revolved around testimony and executive privilege began in architecture and access. Watergate's design and function also shaped the early confusion of the case. A mixed-use complex could contain many possible stories at once. A man in a hallway might be a guest, a worker, a resident, a guard, a visitor, or someone with no right to be there. A hotel room could be part of an ordinary stay or part of an operation. An office could be closed for the night, but still reachable by stairwell or elevator if a lock was defeated. The same development that made the complex modern and active also created layers of entry and concealment. The setting gave the break-in its uneasy contrast. Outside, the complex stood near some of Washington's most recognizable institutional geography. The Potomac River carried the older symbolic weight of the capital. The Kennedy Center placed culture nearby. Virginia Avenue Northwest placed the address within the working map of official Washington. Inside, however, the scene narrowed to quiet corridors, locked doors, and the sixth-floor offices later identified in Washington Post reporting as those of the Democratic National Committee. That narrowing is part of the investigative power of the story. Watergate as a complex was large, prominent, and carefully planned. The crime scene within it was specific, enclosed, and practical. The scandal moved between those scales again and again. It began with a door and expanded to a presidency. It began in a building designed for mixed public and private use and grew into a national argument about the boundaries of political power. It began with a local police response and eventually drew in the FBI, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the White House. The building's name endured because it was attached to the first undeniable fact: Before anyone could prove a cover-up, before witnesses described conversations inside the administration, before the White House recording system became known, there was a break-in at Watergate. That fact did not depend on interpretation. Men were found inside a political party's offices in the middle of the night. The location gave the event a name before the country understood its meaning. In the archive of the scandal, the Watergate complex appears not as scenery, but as evidence of where the chain began. The National Archives trial exhibit material includes photographs of the complex, a reminder that investigators and prosecutors needed to document the place itself. They needed to show where people moved, where rooms were located, and how an operation that seemed at first like burglary could unfold inside a development built for many uses at once. This is why the word Watergate could carry so much. It was concrete enough to be a location and flexible enough to become a symbol. It named a physical site at 2500 Virginia Avenue Northwest, near the Potomac River and the Kennedy Center. It named a modern complex designed by Luigi Moretti, built between 1963 and 1971 on former industrial land. It named hotel rooms, offices, retail space, residences, stairwells, locks, and corridors. And then, gradually, it named the crisis that grew from them. The architecture did not cause the scandal, but it shaped the first scene of exposure. The complex brought together people and purposes under one name. It offered access points in private spaces, public circulation, and restricted offices. It was visible, respectable, and ordinary in the way important urban places often are. That ordinariness made the discovery more startling. What happened there was not supposed to happen there. By the time Americans came to use Watergate as shorthand, the original place could almost disappear behind the political meaning. But to understand the break-in, the place has to come back into focus. The scandal did not begin as an abstraction about power. It began in a specific Washington development near the river, in a complex where offices and hotel rooms shared the same name, where a guard could notice something wrong with a door, and where police would soon move through the building toward the Democratic National Committee offices. There, the story tightened again, from architecture to crime scene. The broad curves and mixed uses of Watergate gave way to the immediate facts of an arrest, officers responding, offices entered after hours, and 5 men found inside a political party's headquarters before dawn. From the outside, Watergate still looked like architecture. Curved walls, quiet windows, a large complex near the river after midnight. Inside, after Frank Wills called for help, it became something narrower and more urgent. It became a building with a route through it, a set of doors to be checked, and a political office suite where no one was supposed to be moving around in the dark. The police response began with the kind of call that, at first, did not explain itself. A night security guard had found tape on doors, removed it, and then found that tape again. That was enough. In an office building after hours, tape on a lock was not decoration. It was a way to defeat a door without leaving it visibly forced open. It suggested that someone wanted to pass through a secured entrance and return through it again. The officers who came to Watergate were not arriving at a famous crime scene. They were answering a security call. The scale of the event was still hidden. There was no public language yet for Watergate as a national crisis. There were no televised hearings, no Supreme Court fight over tapes, no resignation speech. There was only a building in Washington, D.C., a guard's report, and the possibility that someone was inside after hours. That is what gives the early police response its lasting force. The officers were not investigating a constitutional scandal. They were trying to determine whether a burglary was in progress. The Washington Post would report that the Democratic National Committee offices were on the 6th floor. That detail matters because it restores the break-in to its physical setting. This was not an abstract intrusion into politics. It was an entry into rooms occupied by one of the country's major political parties, in an office complex where ordinary security depended on locks, corridors, stairwells, and the judgment of people working overnight. The route upward through the building turned a suspicious door into a search. The officers had to move through Watergate as a structure, from the guarded areas into the office portions, toward the 6th floor, toward the Democratic National Committee suite. In the quiet of the early morning, the building's design no longer mattered as modern architecture. What mattered were access points, exits, hallways, and rooms. Press accounts placed the arrests at about 2:30 in the morning. By then, the night had already shifted into the early hours of June 17th, 1972. Washington was still asleep in the ordinary sense. But inside Watergate, a sequence was unfolding that would eventually pull in the FBI, prosecutors, congressional investigators, the White House, and the courts. At the moment of arrest, however, the confirmed facts were stark and limited. 5 men were found inside the Democratic National Committee offices. They were not staff members working late. They were not guards. They were arrested as burglars in a political party's headquarters in the middle of the night. Their names would become part of the first public roster of Watergate: James McCord, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. Each name would later carry a larger set of associations. But in the first frame of the story, they were the 5 men taken into custody inside the offices. That immediate fact was enough to make the burglary unusual. The location was not a private home, a store, or a warehouse. It was the Democratic National Committee. In a presidential election year, that alone raised questions before any larger conspiracy could be proved. James McCord's name would soon matter in a particular way. The research record notes that the FBI was alerted on the day of the break-in and that acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray was notified by teletype that one arrested man was connected to the committee to re-elect the president. That connection belongs to the next turn of the investigation, when the burglary began to point beyond the men in the room. But even before that link became central, McCord was one of the men physically caught inside the DNC offices. Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis were also part of that first arrest scene. Their presence made the incident harder to explain as an ordinary theft. There were 5 men, not one. They had entered political offices, not a cash register. The hour was deep night. The doors had been prepared with tape. The police did not need to know the full purpose of the operation to recognize that the scene was organized. Later, the National Archives would identify trial defendants connected to the Watergate burglary case as G. Gordon Liddy, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, E. Howard Hunt, James McCord, Bernard Barker, and Virgilio Gonzalez. That later list is important because it shows how the circle widened beyond the 5 men arrested inside the offices. G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt would become associated figures in the case and later defendants in the broader legal record around the burglary. But on the 6th floor, in the early hours of June 17th, the police had something more immediate than a chart of connections. They had bodies in rooms where those men did not belong. That distinction is crucial. Watergate is often remembered backward, from the resignation of President Richard Nixon to the break-in that began it. But the evidence did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. The first confirmed layer was not a presidential tape or a Senate witness. It was an arrest. Men were found inside a party headquarters after a guard noticed tampered doors and police responded. In an investigative story, that first layer sets the boundary between suspicion and fact. Suspicion was the tape. Fact was the arrest. Suspicion was that someone might have entered the building. Fact was that 5 men were found inside the Democratic National Committee offices. From that point forward, investigators could ask who they were, why they were there, how they entered, what they carried, and who, if anyone, had sent them. The 6th-floor setting also gave the story a contained shape. There was a building. There was a floor. There were offices. There were men inside. The scale of the later scandal can make that simplicity easy to miss. But early accountability often begins in exactly that way, not with a sweeping theory, but with the plain description of a place and a violation. In the first public understanding, the case still looked like a burglary. That word was accurate as far as it went. The men were arrested inside offices after hours. Yet the office belonged to the Democratic National Committee, and the timing fell in the middle of a presidential campaign year. Those facts gave the word burglary a political echo almost immediately. It was no longer only a question of property. It was a question of intrusion into the operations of political opposition. Still, careful reconstruction requires restraint. The officers at Watergate did not need to solve the presidency that night. They did not need to know the names that would later dominate hearings and legal filings. Their task was to respond to a call, inspect the building, and act on what they found. What they found was enough to begin a criminal case, and without anyone yet knowing it, a national investigation. The arrests gave investigators names. Names led to records. Records led to associations. Associations led outward from the sixth floor. But before the outward movement, there was the room itself, and the immediate question any investigator would ask: what were these men doing there? That question could not be answered by names alone. It required the material record of the arrest. The contents found with the burglars and the objects later preserved or described in trial exhibits would begin to show why the incident looked different from a routine break-in. Surgical gloves, burglary tools, walkie-talkie equipment, cash, photographs, an address book page, and concealed microphones would pull the investigation from presence to purpose. For the moment, the essential fact remained quiet and devastating. In the early morning darkness of June 17, 1972, police responding to a guard's call entered the Watergate complex and arrested James McCord, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis inside the Democratic National Committee offices. 5 men, 1 political headquarters, 1 sixth-floor crime scene. The larger scandal had not yet taken its final shape, but the first frame had been fixed. The arrests fixed the first frame of the Watergate story. But the next frame came from the inventory, from the things the men carried into the Democratic National Committee offices, and the things investigators would later connect to the rooms around them. A break-in can sometimes be explained by what is missing. Here, from the first hours, it was explained by what was found. The objects mattered because they did not describe an ordinary theft. They pointed to preparation, communication, concealment, and surveillance. They suggested that the men inside the sixth-floor offices had not simply wandered into a political headquarters looking for valuables. They had come with equipment. They had come with methods. And when the evidence began to move from the crime scene into official records, it created a chain of questions that reached beyond the men arrested in the building. Some of those objects were practical and quiet: surgical gloves, burglary tools, and walkie-talkie equipment. They are not dramatic by themselves. Surgical gloves could keep fingerprints off surfaces. Burglary tools could help open doors, drawers, or cabinets. Walkie-talkie equipment could let people in different parts of the operation speak to one another without shouting across hallways or using the building's ordinary systems. In a night office complex, those details mattered. Watergate was not a single room. It was a mixed-use complex of hotel space, offices, residences, and commercial areas, with routes that could separate lookouts, intruders, and possible handlers. Communication equipment made the scene feel organized rather than improvised. Then there was the cash. Records and reporting described $2,300 found with the men. Cash at a crime scene is always double-edged evidence. It may pay for travel, rooms, food, equipment, or silence. It may also raise the question investigators ask early in almost every conspiracy case: where did the money come from? At the moment of arrest, the cash did not prove the full design of the operation. It did not, by itself, identify who planned it or who financed it. But it made the burglary look less like 5 isolated men acting on impulse and more like a job with resources behind it. Photographs added another layer. In a burglary, photographs can be personal clutter, useful identification, or working material. In the Watergate case, they belong to a broader set of physical evidence later preserved and described in the record. The National Archives trial exhibit material includes photographs of the Watergate complex itself. That is important for an archive report because the building was not only the setting. It became part of the evidence field. Its entrances, rooms, and internal geography mattered. The curved exterior that had made Watergate visually distinctive now appeared in another form, as a documented location tied to a criminal investigation. The most striking objects were the ones designed to disappear into ordinary life. The National Archives identifies trial exhibit material showing chapstick tubes with hidden microphones. The disguise is almost too small to carry the weight it later held. A chapstick tube is the kind of object no one is supposed to notice. It belongs in a pocket, a purse, a desk drawer. It suggests dryness, weather, daily habit. But inside these tubes were concealed microphones. That detail changed the meaning of the burglary. If the burglars had carried only tools for entry, the first question might have been what they intended to steal. With concealed microphones, the question became what they intended to hear. The Democratic National Committee offices were not a jewelry store, a bank, or a private apartment. They were the headquarters of a political organization during a presidential election year. Listening devices inside that space would be instruments of political intelligence gathering. They would be used not to remove an object from a room, but to turn conversations into information. That is why the chapstick microphones matter so deeply in the physical record. They show the strange intimacy of the operation. Political espionage in this form did not look like a spy novel with a dramatic device on a table. It looked like something familiar, hollowed out and repurposed. The evidence was small enough to be held in the hand, yet serious enough to shift the interpretation of the entire crime. The address book page carried its own kind of quiet force. The National Archives identifies Bernard Barker's address book page as trial exhibit material found in a Watergate hotel room on June 18, 1972. That date matters. It was the day after the arrests. By then, investigators were no longer looking only at the men taken from the Democratic National Committee offices. They were looking outward from the arrest site into the connected spaces of Watergate, including hotel rooms associated with the operation. An address book page is not a weapon or a tool. It is a map of human connection. Names, numbers, and notes can tell investigators who a person knew, who might have been called, and where a trail might lead. Like the cache, the page did not automatically answer every question, but it pointed investigators toward relationships. In a case that would become defined by links between burglars, campaign operatives, government officials, and efforts to conceal responsibility, that kind of document was not minor. It was connective tissue. The fact that the address book page was found in a Watergate hotel room also shows how the complex itself worked as an investigative landscape. Earlier, Watergate was the building where Frank Wills saw tape on a door and police arrested 5 men in the Democratic National Committee offices. Now it was a wider scene. A hotel room could contain evidence. A hallway could be part of a route. A stairwell door could mark the beginning of exposure. The building's mixed uses, ordinary in design, became significant in retrospect because they allowed different parts of the operation to exist under one name. This is where the physical evidence began to build pressure. Each item could be described plainly: gloves, tools, radios, cash, photographs, a page from an address book, chapstick tubes containing microphones. But together they formed a pattern. The gloves suggested concealment. The tools suggested entry. The radios suggested coordination. The cache suggested backing. The photographs and address book page suggested planning and connection. The hidden microphones suggested surveillance. The pattern did not yet equal the full scandal. It is important not to rush the evidence beyond what it could prove in the first hours. The presence of equipment did not immediately explain who ordered the break-in, who paid for it, or who would later try to protect whom. The objects could not yet tell the country about secret White House tapes, Senate hearings, or a Supreme Court fight over presidential recordings. Those came later, but the objects did something essential at the beginning. They made the official story harder to contain as a simple burglary. They also gave investigators something durable. Testimony can shift. Memories can be challenged. Explanations can be revised. Physical evidence stays stubborn. A tool has a shape. A radio has a function. A microphone hidden in a chapstick tube has an intended use. An address book page carries marks that can be examined. A photograph fixes a view. In the Watergate case, the archive would become central to public understanding. The National Archives trial exhibits now preserve fragments of that first material trail, showing how small items became part of a much larger constitutional history. There is a quiet irony in that. The operation appears to have depended on concealment, covered hands, hidden microphones, after-hours movement, communication kept out of ordinary channels. Yet the objects left behind did the opposite. They revealed method. They gave investigators a vocabulary for the crime. They showed that the men arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices had arrived with more than intent to enter. They had arrived with a system. By the end of June 17, 1972, that system was already beginning to attract federal attention. The evidence from the rooms and from the men did not stand alone for long. The crime scene had produced its physical questions. Now the investigation would begin, asking where those questions led. One of the names tied to the arrested men would soon carry the case out of the building and toward the president's re-election campaign, changing the meaning of the burglary again. By the end of that first day, the Watergate evidence was no longer only a collection of objects. It was becoming a chain. The gloves, tools, communications equipment, cash, photographs, and concealed microphones had already made the break-in look organized. But objects can only take an investigation so far. They can show method. They can suggest planning. What they cannot do alone is explain sponsorship, authority, or motive. That is where the first name mattered. On June 17, 1972, the same day police arrested 5 men inside the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., the FBI was alerted. The break-in was not being handled simply as an after-hours trespass or an ordinary burglary. The setting itself had changed the stakes. The office suite belonged to a national political party, and the arrests came in the middle of a presidential election year. Then, early in the federal response, acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray was notified by teletype that one of the arrested men was connected to the committee to re-elect the president. The name attached to that early connection was James McCord. McCord had been one of the 5 men arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices. In the first police frame of the case, he was one of the burglars, a man found with the others in the 6th-floor political headquarters after Frank Wills's call brought police into the building. But the teletype to L. Patrick Gray gave investigators a second frame. McCord was not only a person caught at a crime scene. He was connected to the official organization working to re-elect President Richard Nixon. That organization was the Committee to Re-elect the President, often abbreviated as CRP. Its purpose was not obscure. It belonged to the machinery of presidential politics, fundraising, organizing, messaging, and the practical work of securing another term for the incumbent president. A link from that organization to a man arrested inside the opposition party's offices was explosive, even before anyone knew how far the link reached, who had approved what, or whether higher officials had any knowledge of the operation. This distinction is important. On June 17, 1972, the teletype did not prove a White House conspiracy. It did not prove that President Nixon knew about the break-in. It did not by itself explain who planned the operation, who financed it, or whether anyone tried to obstruct the investigation afterward. Those questions would come later, through interviews, subpoenas, testimony, documents, money trails, and eventually tape recordings. But the teletype did something essential at the very beginning. It prevented the burglary from staying small. Before that early campaign connection, the facts could still be described in narrow criminal terms. 5 men had been arrested inside an office suite where they did not belong. They carried tools and surveillance-related materials. They were inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate office complex near the Potomac River. It was serious, but it might have remained a strange criminal episode with political overtones. McCord's connection to the committee to re-elect the president changed the direction of inquiry. It made the central question larger than entry. The question was no longer only how the men got into the building or what they intended to do once they reached the offices. It became whether political espionage had reached into the re-election operation of a sitting president. That was the first investigative turn. The FBI's involvement mattered because the case now had a path beyond the arresting officers and the immediate evidence. A burglary investigation can begin with a door, a witness, and a search of suspects. But when the suspects appear to connect to a national campaign, the route widens. Investigators have to ask about employment, affiliations, communications, payments, instructions, and relationships. They have to determine whether the crime scene reflects the decisions of isolated individuals or an operation tied to institutions with political power. In the Watergate case, the institution named in that first federal alert was not a fringe group. It was not an anonymous private employer. It was the President's Re-election Committee. That meant any inquiry would move through politically charged ground from the first day. The phrase "committee to re-elect the president" carried a direct institutional meaning. It pointed toward a campaign apparatus organized around Richard Nixon's return to office. Still, careful language matters here. The early fact was a connection, not a complete explanation. The record identified McCord as connected to the committee. It did not, at that moment, lay out the full structure of responsibility. In an archive report view of the case, this is the kind of distinction that keeps the story honest. Watergate later became so large and its outcome so dramatic that it is easy to read the end backward into the beginning. But on the day of the break-in, investigators were still at the stage of names, addresses, equipment, and first reports. The scandal had not yet fully revealed itself. It had only begun to point. That pointing was enough. A political burglary is different from a burglary committed for money or property. The target in this case was not a jewelry store, a warehouse, or a private apartment. It was the Democratic National Committee. The items tied to the suspects suggested surveillance and covert entry. And now, through McCord, one arrested man was linked to the organization working for the Republican president's re-election. The pieces did not yet form the final picture, but they were no longer random. The first link also showed why Watergate would become a story about systems. The physical system had already been visible in the objects: gloves to avoid traces, tools to enter, walkie-talkie equipment to coordinate, hidden microphones to listen. Then, the political system now appeared in the institutional connection: a campaign committee, a national election, a presidency seeking another term. The case began to sit at the crossing point between covert method and public power. For L. Patrick Gray, the notification came at a precarious moment in the life of the Bureau. He was acting FBI director, and the Bureau was now being drawn into an investigation that touched the president's own campaign. That fact alone created tension. The FBI's job was to investigate the crime, but the crime was quickly becoming entangled with the political world above it. The same federal government responsible for enforcing the law included the administration whose re-election committee had just been named in connection with one of the men arrested. This is where the future shape of Watergate can be heard quietly in the first reports, not in a full confession, not in a dramatic public revelation, but in the administrative language of notification. The Bureau alerted, the acting director informed, the name of a campaign committee entering the file. Watergate would become famous for televised hearings and secret recordings, for legal battles and constitutional claims. Yet before all of that, there was a teletype carrying a fact that could not be ignored. The connection to the committee to re-elect the president also gave journalists and investigators a reason to keep pressing. A burglary with odd equipment might produce curiosity. A burglary at party headquarters during an election year might produce suspicion. But a burglary in which one arrested man was connected to the president's re-election organization produced a question the public could understand immediately. Why would anyone tied to the president's campaign be inside the opposition party's offices after midnight? That question did not accuse everyone. It did not answer itself. But it demanded an investigation larger than the room where the men were found. The early significance of McCord's link was not that it solved Watergate. It was that it opened Watergate. It created a path from the 6th floor of the Watergate office complex to campaign offices, from tools and microphones to political authority, from police custody to federal scrutiny. It suggested that the break-in might belong to a broader practice of intelligence gathering and concealment within the election campaign. Once that possibility existed, the investigation could not remain safely contained. Each answer would create another question. Who knew McCord? Who hired him? Who had contact with the others? What was the purpose of the equipment? Where did the money come from? Were the burglars acting alone or under direction? And if direction existed, how far upward did it go? Those questions would define the next stage of the scandal. The story was moving away from the immediate facts of arrest and possession and toward the harder terrain of knowledge, authorization, and response. The first link to the president's campaign did not yet establish a cover-up, but it made a cover-up possible as a subject of inquiry because it placed the break-in close enough to power that powerful people might have reasons to explain it, distance themselves from it, or stop investigators from seeing where it led. On June 17, 1972, the Watergate burglary had already changed shape several times. It began with tape on a door. It became a police response. It became 5 arrests inside the Democratic National Committee offices. It became a set of physical exhibits suggesting surveillance and planning. And then, through the teletype to acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray, it became something more politically dangerous, a criminal investigation with an early line running toward the committee to re-elect the president. From that point forward, Watergate was not only about what happened inside an office complex near the Potomac River. It was about the conduct of a presidential campaign, the pressure placed on investigators, and the choices made by officials when a small burglary threatened to expose a larger political operation. The door had opened. The first institutional link had appeared. Now the question was not only who entered the Democratic offices, but who would try to control the story after they were caught. By the time the first line had appeared between the Watergate arrests and the committee to re-elect the president, the case had changed in character. It was still a burglary investigation, still rooted in doors, offices, equipment, and the men found inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters. But the deeper question was no longer only how the burglars got in. It was what happened after they were caught. That is where Watergate became more than a crime scene. It became a test of institutions. In the first hours, the investigation moved in the familiar language of law enforcement. Police made arrests. The FBI was alerted. Acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray was notified by teletype that one arrested man was connected to the president's re-election organization. That fact did not prove, by itself, that the White House had ordered the break-in. It did not answer who planned it, who approved it, or how far knowledge of it reached. But it placed the investigation near the machinery of national politics, and once that happened, every official response mattered. The question became, would the investigation be allowed to run its course? Watergate's lasting power comes from that shift. The original offense was an entry into a political party's offices in Washington, D.C. The larger scandal grew from the effort to manage what that entry might reveal. In the months that followed, investigators, reporters, prosecutors, and eventually Congress would have to follow not only the burglars, but the reactions around them: denials, pressure, money, testimony, and the use or attempted use of federal power. At the center of that widening circle stood President Richard Nixon. He was not one of the men arrested at Watergate. He was not found in the sixth-floor offices. The central issue became different and more dangerous. What did the president know after the arrests? What did he do with that knowledge? And did he participate in any plan to obstruct the investigation? Around Nixon were names that would become inseparable from the scandal. H.R. Haldeman, one of the president's closest aides, would appear in the recorded history of Watergate as a direct participant in conversations about how to contain the investigation. John W. Dean III, White House counsel, would later testify that President Nixon had approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in. John Ehrlichman, another senior White House figure, became part of the same landscape of testimony and inquiry. John N. Mitchell, tied to the political world around the re-election effort, belonged to the circle of campaign figures whose conduct drew scrutiny as the investigation expanded. Alexander Butterfield, a former aide, would later reveal the existence of a voice-activated White House taping system in several rooms. And L. Patrick Gray, as acting FBI director, occupied a crucial institutional position at the moment when the criminal inquiry began reaching toward the president's campaign. These names matter not because they form a cast list, but because Watergate became a story about channels of power. The burglary was carried out by men with equipment and cash. The cover-up question moved through offices, agencies, campaign committees, and the presidency itself. One of the most important mechanisms was control over information. A burglary investigation depends on interviews, documents, money trails, and cooperation between agencies. If officials with political power tried to slow that process, narrow it, redirect it, or hide relevant connections, then the scandal moved from political espionage into obstruction. That is why the early link to the committee to re-elect the president was so explosive. It created a line of inquiry that investigators could follow, and it created a reason for others to fear where that line might lead. Campaign money became part of the same problem. The physical evidence from Watergate had already included cash. The investigation would grow into questions about payments, support, and the financing of silence. Later, one of the defining White House conversations would be remembered for its discussion of blackmail, perjury, and paying burglars. That language was far from the taped door where the story began, but it belonged to the same chain. The first clue showed entry. The later questions showed pressure. Pressure to conceal, pressure to protect, pressure to keep the original crime from exposing a broader operation. The presidency added another layer. Presidents have legitimate powers. They oversee the executive branch. They receive confidential advice. They discuss national security, law enforcement, and political strategy with senior aides. But Watergate forced a hard constitutional question into public view. Where does presidential confidentiality end when evidence is needed in a criminal investigation? That question would eventually reach the Supreme Court in United States v. Nixon. The court would require production of subpoenaed presidential tape recordings and documents for a criminal proceeding, rejecting Nixon's broad claim of executive privilege. But before the legal ruling, before the release of the most damaging recordings, the country had to confront the possibility that presidential power itself had been used to contain a criminal inquiry. The tape, later described by the Nixon Library as the smoking gun conversation, would show why that concern became so serious. Recorded on June 23, 1972, only days after the break-in, it captured Nixon and H.R. Haldeman discussing having the CIA ask the FBI to halt or limit the Watergate investigation by claiming a national security reason. That detail mattered because it was not just about public relations. It was about whether one federal agency might be used to interfere with another agency's investigation. In that sense, Watergate became a map of boundaries. The FBI had a criminal investigation to pursue. The CIA had a different institutional role. The White House had authority, but not unlimited authority. The president could claim confidentiality, but not a blanket right to withhold evidence in a criminal proceeding. Each boundary became more visible as the case advanced. John Dean would become central because he gave words to the cover-up claim. His later testimony that President Nixon had approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in changed the scale of the scandal. It no longer revolved only around the burglars or even around campaign aides. It turned directly toward the president's own response to the investigation. Dean's testimony also helped move the public understanding of Watergate from suspicion to allegation, not just that something had gone wrong, but that people in power had acted to prevent the full truth from emerging. Alexander Butterfield's role would become equally consequential for a different reason. Testimony can be disputed. Memories can be challenged. Officials can deny, reinterpret, or claim misunderstanding. But Butterfield's revelation that Nixon maintained a voice-activated recording system in several White House rooms changed the evidentiary terrain. It meant that some of the most important conversations about Watergate might not depend only on recollection. They might exist as recordings made inside the presidency itself. That discovery would later transform Watergate into an archive of power, speaking in private. But in this phase, before the full public drama of the tapes, the central issue was already clear. A small burglary had created a chain of consequences that reached into the president's campaign, the White House staff, the FBI, and the constitutional limits of executive authority. This is why the cover-up became the heart of Watergate. The break-in was the triggering act. The cover-up was the sustained crisis. It raised the question of whether political survival had been placed above law enforcement, whether campaign interests had shaped official conduct, and whether the presidency could shield itself from accountability. By early 1973, those questions could no longer remain inside investigative files, courtrooms, or newspaper stories. The criminal case had opened the door. The evidence had pointed outward. The names around the president had entered public scrutiny, and the unanswered questions had grown too large for private inquiry alone. The next stage would require a different forum: public hearings, sworn testimony, subpoena power, and a national audience listening as the machinery of government investigated the campaign that had just won the presidency. By early 1973, Watergate had become too large for any single courtroom, agency, or newspaper column to contain. The arrests had produced evidence. The early investigation had produced links. The cover-up question had produced a more difficult kind of uncertainty. Not simply what had happened, but whether the institutions closest to the presidency had tried to keep it from being known. That was the setting when the United States Senate moved to create a new forum for the case. On February 7, 1973, the Senate voted unanimously to establish the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. The name was formal, almost restrained. In public memory, it would become known by a simpler name: the Senate Watergate Committee. The unanimity mattered. This was not a narrow procedural vote carried by one party over another. Every senator voting agreed that the questions raised by the break-in, the campaign connections, and the suspected cover-up required a special investigation. The Senate was not replacing the criminal courts or the work of federal investigators. It was doing something different. It was asserting that the conduct of a presidential campaign, especially one connected by evidence and testimony to a criminal entry into an opposition party's headquarters, was a matter for congressional inquiry. The committee was built with an intentional balance. It had 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. That structure reflected the political reality of the Senate, but it also gave the investigation a degree of bipartisan form. The subject was explosive: the campaign of a sitting president, Richard Nixon, who had just won re-election in 1972. If the inquiry appeared to be only a partisan weapon, its findings could be dismissed as political theater. If it appeared too cautious, it could fail to answer the questions already pressing on the country. So the committee's membership was not only an administrative detail. It was part of the credibility of the investigation. 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 1 committee, and a shared mandate to follow the evidence into territory that might touch campaign officials, White House aides, law enforcement decisions, and the president's own political operation. The Senate gave the committee subpoena power. That phrase sounds technical, but it was one of the most important tools in the entire investigation. Without subpoena power, the committee could request cooperation. With it, the committee could compel witnesses and records. It could require people to appear, to answer under oath, and to provide documents. Watergate had already shown the limits of voluntary disclosure. The central question was whether a cover-up had occurred. A body investigating a possible cover-up could not rely only on the willingness of those being investigated to explain themselves. The committee was also given a budget of $500,000. In the language of appropriations, that figure was practical. In the story of Watergate, it marked the Senate's decision to build a real investigative operation. Staff, counsel, preparation, document review, witness questioning, and the machinery needed to turn scattered leads into a public record. The work ahead would not be a single hearing or a short round of speeches. It would require organization. Its mandate was broad. The committee was directed to investigate the Watergate break-in, the cover-up, and other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct connected to the 1972 presidential campaign. Each part of that charge opened a different door. The break-in was the starting point, the entry into the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., where 5 men had been arrested in the early morning hours of June 17, 1972. That was the visible crime, the event that had placed the name Watergate into police reports, court records, and newspaper stories. The cover-up was the second and larger question. It asked whether people in positions of power had acted to conceal the truth about that crime, to obstruct investigators, or to prevent the public from seeing the connection between the burglars and the president's re-election operation. This was where the scandal moved beyond the men found inside the offices. It reached toward campaign money, official pressure, and decisions made in the shadow of the White House. Then there was the final phrase: other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct in the 1972 presidential campaign. That language gave the committee room to examine the broader culture of campaign activity around the re-election effort. The Senate was not limiting itself to the taped doors, the arrests, or the immediate aftermath. It was asking whether Watergate was one incident or part of a wider pattern. At the center of the committee stood Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, its chairman. Ervin brought to the role the authority of a senior senator and the public manner of someone steeped in constitutional language. He would become one of the most recognizable figures of the hearings, but at the moment of the committee's creation, his importance was institutional. He represented the Senate's power to investigate, to ask questions not as rumor or accusation, but as part of the legislative branch's responsibility to examine abuses of power. Beside him was the vice chairman, Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, a Republican. Baker's role was crucial because the investigation concerned the campaign of a Republican president. His presence helped define the committee as more than an opposition inquiry. It also placed a Republican voice inside the center of the questioning. The committee would have to navigate loyalty, skepticism, evidence, and public trust. Baker's position made that tension visible. The chief counsel was Samuel Dash. His work would be less theatrical than the public image of senators at the hearing table, but no less important. A committee with subpoena power and a broad mandate needed legal direction. Witnesses had to be prepared. Documents had to be reviewed. Questions had to be ordered so that testimony did more than create headlines. It had to build a record. Dash's role was to help turn the Senate's political authority into an investigative process capable of surviving scrutiny. This was the moment when Watergate entered a new stage. Before the Senate committee, the story had moved through police work, federal investigation, court proceedings, and reporting. Each had revealed part of the structure. But the creation of the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities changed the scale and the setting. The case would now unfold in a forum designed for public accountability. That did not mean the answers were already known. The committee's creation was not a verdict. It was a recognition that the existing facts demanded a fuller inquiry. A night guard had noticed tape on a door. Police had found men inside a political party's offices. Evidence had included surveillance tools and cash. An early link had reached the committee to re-elect the president. Questions had gathered around aides, campaign officials, and the response of the administration. By February 7, 1973, the Senate was saying that these facts could not be treated as isolated fragments. The committee's power came partly from its structure and partly from its timing. Nixon had been re-elected only months earlier. The authority of the presidency was still fresh from a national victory. Yet the Senate was now preparing to examine the conduct of the campaign that had helped secure that victory. That contrast gave the investigation its quiet force. A campaign could win overwhelmingly and still be subject to questions about law, ethics, and the misuse of power. In an archive, the formation of a committee can look like procedure: a vote, a name, a budget, a list of members, a grant of authority. But in Watergate, procedure became the pathway to revelation. The unanimous vote created the room in which witnesses would be called and records would be tested. The subpoena power gave that room teeth. The bipartisan membership gave it balance. The mandate gave it reach. And soon, the room itself would become part of the story. The investigation would no longer be something Americans followed only through printed accounts or official summaries. It would acquire voices, pauses, oaths, denials, and questions asked in real time. What began as a Senate inquiry would become a national listening experience, as the machinery of accountability moved from institutional design into public view. The committee had been created by vote, budget, membership, and mandate. But for most Americans, those details were still distant. They belonged to the formal language of the Senate, to the architecture of congressional power. The transformation came when the hearings began to leave the hearing room. In May 1973, the Senate Watergate hearings became a national broadcast. For 2 weeks that month, television news outlets carried the hearings live. The proceedings did not wait for evening summaries or next morning headlines. They unfolded during the day in the slow rhythm of public testimony. Questions were asked. Witnesses paused. Lawyers conferred. Senators leaned toward microphones. Names already familiar from newspapers were spoken under oath, inside a room where the stakes were no longer speculative. And then, after the workday, the hearings continued in another form. PBS carried them in prime time on more than 150 affiliates, giving the country a second chance to hear what had been said. That detail mattered. It meant Watergate was not only watched by people who could sit near a television during daytime hours. It entered living rooms at night. It entered homes after dinner. It became part of the ordinary national routine. The break-in had begun as a physical intrusion into the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate complex. The early evidence had been material: tape on a door, burglary tools, walkie-talkie equipment, cash, photographs, an address book page, chapstick tubes with hidden microphones. The investigation had then moved outward, toward campaign money, political intelligence gathering, and the conduct of officials close to the presidency. But the hearings changed the experience of the scandal. They gave the evidence a voice. That is one of the quiet powers of a public hearing. A document can be read privately. A memo can be summarized. A witness statement can be quoted in a newspaper. But testimony is different. It asks the public to listen to a person speak in real time, under oath, with all the human hesitations still attached. There are pauses that do not appear in a transcript as fully as they are felt in a room. There are questions that land with more force because they are heard before they are answered. There are moments when the machinery of accountability becomes almost audible. The oath, the microphone, the name of the witness, the senator's question, the counsel's follow-up, the silence before a reply. The Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities had been given subpoena power and a mandate to investigate the break-in, the cover-up, and other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct in the 1972 presidential campaign. Those words had defined the committee's reach. The broadcast defined its audience. The country was no longer receiving Watergate as a series of fragments. It was hearing the process by which fragments were tested. A question could begin with one known fact and move toward another. A witness could confirm, deny, narrow, or complicate what had previously been reported. The public did not have to accept only the final conclusion of an investigator or the framing of an official statement. Viewers could hear the steps. That did not make the hearing simple. Watergate was not a single act with a single witness. It involved campaign officials, White House aides, law enforcement, money, political pressure, and the question of whether the investigation itself had been obstructed. It involved people whose roles overlapped but were not identical. Richard Nixon, H.R. Haldeman, John W. Dean III, John Ehrlichman, John N. Mitchell, Alexander Butterfield, L. Patrick Gray, and others whose names would enter the record at different stages. The hearings did not reduce that complexity. They made the complexity public. Chairman Sam Ervin of North Carolina presided over the committee with the authority given by the Senate's unanimous vote. Vice Chairman Howard Baker of Tennessee represented the committee's bipartisan structure, and Chief Counsel Samuel Dash helped guide the questioning within the institutional frame the Senate had created. The committee's shape mattered because the hearings were not a television program invented for drama. They were a constitutional process being broadcast. The drama came from the fact that the process was real. In an archive report, it is tempting to focus on the most explosive revelations, the sentence that changes a case, the witness who alters the direction of history. Those moments would come. But before any single claim could define the hearings, the broadcasts themselves changed the scale of Watergate. They made the investigation communal. Millions of Americans were not just learning that officials had been questioned, they were hearing questions asked. The sound of the hearings carried a different kind of authority from a printed account. It contained procedure, and procedure was part of the message. Each witness appeared in an official setting. Each answer was tied to the risk of perjury. Each statement was made before senators who had the power to compel testimony and gather records. The hearings reminded the public that accountability was not only a conclusion, it was a sequence. Establish jurisdiction, call witnesses, ask questions, test answers, compare testimony, pursue contradictions, and return again to the central issue. Who knew? Who acted? Who tried to stop the investigation? Those questions had been present since the case moved beyond the 5 men arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices. But hearing them pursued in public gave them new weight. Watergate was no longer only a scandal that citizens read about. It was a civic event that citizens followed together. In offices, homes, bars, campuses, and kitchens, the same voices could be heard. The country was not unified in what it believed, but it was increasingly unified in the fact that it was listening. The primetime PBS broadcasts deepened that effect. More than 150 affiliates carried the hearings at night, when the audience could gather around the testimony as if it were a national record being read aloud. The choice to air the hearings beyond the live daytime window helped turn a Senate inquiry into a shared public archive. It preserved not only the substance of testimony, but the experience of hearing public power question private conduct inside government. And Watergate was especially suited to that kind of listening because so much of the scandal depended on words spoken in official and unofficial rooms. Plans, denials, instructions, warnings, payments, and explanations all mattered. The cover-up question was not only about whether something had been done. It was about what had been said, who said it, who heard it, and what those words meant when placed beside other evidence. The hearings placed the spoken word at the center of the story before the White House tapes were publicly understood as the archive they would become. At this stage, testimony was the national instrument. A witness's memory could carry the investigation forward. A senator's question could open a new line of inquiry. A careful answer could signal limits. A pause could suggest pressure. The country listened as the public record was built, one statement at a time. That is why the May broadcasts stand as more than a media event. They were part of the investigation's force. They made secrecy harder to maintain. They made official language harder to hide behind. They made the distance between Washington procedure and ordinary public judgment much smaller. The same government that had been accused of concealing facts was now, through another branch, asking for those facts in open session. The burglary had taken place in the early morning darkness of June 17, 1972. The hearings took place in light, under cameras, microphones, oaths, and the fixed attention of a country trying to understand whether a criminal case had reached into the presidency itself. The contrast was powerful. A taped door in a stairwell had led, through investigation and resistance, to a televised reckoning. By the time the hearings became a national broadcast, Watergate had become more than a question of evidence. It had become a test of whether democratic institutions could make hidden conduct visible. The Senate committee provided the forum. Television carried the forum outward. PBS returned it to the public at night. And inside that repeated act of listening, the scandal gained momentum. Soon, one witness would give the hearings a sharper and more dangerous center. Former White House counsel John Dean would speak not only about campaign operatives or aides at the edges of power, but about the president's own role in the response to the break-in. The country had already learned how to listen. Now it would hear a claim that changed what Watergate was asking of the presidency. By the time John Dean came before the Senate Watergate Committee, the country had already been trained in the slow discipline of listening. The hearings had made procedure audible. A question could hang in the air. A witness could pause. A lawyer could return to a date, a name, a meeting, and ask again. What had begun with tape on a door had moved into the language of sworn testimony. Dean's appearance gave that language a new weight. He was not a burglar caught inside the Democratic National Committee offices. He was not simply an outside campaign operative, or a figure who could be placed at the edge of the re-election effort. John W. Dean III had been White House counsel. His office had been inside the institution, now under investigation. He had been close enough to the presidency that his account did not merely describe what outsiders had done. It described what, he said, the White House had known, considered, and approved after the break-in. That distinction mattered. For months, Watergate had contained two overlapping stories. One was the crime story, the men arrested inside the sixth-floor Democratic National Committee offices, the burglary tools, the cash, the surveillance equipment, the chapstick tubes with hidden microphones, and the early connection to the committee to re-elect the president. The other was the cover-up story, the question of whether people around the president had tried to prevent investigators from following those facts wherever they led. Dean's testimony pushed the second story into the center of the room. He testified that President Richard Nixon had approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in. The statement was direct, and its implications were enormous. If Dean was right, then the scandal could no longer be contained as a matter of campaign misconduct, or as an operation carried out by overzealous aides, or as a criminal episode whose political significance ended at the perimeter of the re-election committee. The question became whether the president himself had taken part in the response that followed the burglary. This was not only a change in accusation, it was a change in constitutional gravity. The Senate committee had been created to investigate the break-in, the cover-up, and other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct in the 1972 presidential campaign. That mandate was broad enough to follow evidence from the Watergate complex to campaign offices, from campaign offices to federal agencies, and from federal agencies toward the White House. But Dean's testimony brought the inquiry to the most sensitive point in that chain. It placed the president's own conduct under public scrutiny, not as a distant political beneficiary, but as an alleged participant in decisions about how the investigation should be handled. The room in which Dean spoke had already become familiar to viewers and listeners. Chairman Sam Ervin presided over a committee built with 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Vice Chairman Howard Baker sat as one of the inquiry's central Republican voices. Chief Counsel Samuel Dash helped guide the examination. The structure mattered because Dean's words did not land in a partisan pamphlet or a private meeting. They landed under oath in a public forum created by a unanimous Senate vote before a committee with subpoena power and a national audience listening in real time. That setting made the testimony harder to dismiss as mere rumor and harder to accept without testing. Dean's account was not the end of the inquiry. It was a claim that demanded corroboration. It pointed toward meetings, conversations, and decisions that would have to be compared against documents, other witnesses, and whatever records the investigation could obtain. But even before corroboration, the testimony changed the public shape of Watergate. It gave the scandal a clearer question. What had the president approved, and when had he approved it? For an investigative story, Dean's role was especially complicated because he stood at the intersection of legal advice and political damage control. As White House counsel, he was supposed to serve the presidency as an institution, not merely protect individuals from exposure. Yet the cover-up question placed legal obligation and political loyalty in direct conflict. If the investigation threatened people close to the president, then any effort to block that investigation became more than internal crisis management. It became a possible obstruction of justice. This is why the hearings carried such tension. The words were calm. The setting was formal. But the subject was explosive. The former counsel to the president was telling the Senate that the president had approved a plan to conceal White House connections to a crime committed during a presidential campaign. Dean's testimony also gave new meaning to an earlier pattern that had already troubled investigators. The break-in had not remained an isolated event. Money, silence, and loyalty had become part of the larger story. The men arrested at Watergate were not simply figures in a police report. They became figures whose possible testimony, legal exposure, and demands created pressure on the people above them. Once a burglary produces arrests, the danger for organizers is no longer only that the crime occurred. The danger is that those arrested may speak. That danger is what made the later White House conversation known as the cancer on the presidency conversation so revealing in the broader record of Watergate. The conversation involved Nixon, H.R. Haldeman, and John Dean, and it included discussion of blackmail, perjury, and paying burglars. Those words cut through any attempt to treat the matter as ordinary political embarrassment. Blackmail suggested pressure from people who knew damaging facts. Perjury suggested false testimony under oath. Payments to burglars suggested a mechanism for keeping defendants quiet, or at least for managing the consequences of what they might say. Dean's public testimony in that later described conversation belonged to the same dark architecture. One was the sworn account before the Senate. The other was part of the internal White House record that would become crucial as the investigation deepened. Together, they pointed to the same underlying problem. Watergate was no longer simply about how men entered the Democratic National Committee offices. It was about how power responded after the men were caught. That response is often where scandals become more dangerous than the original act. A burglary can be prosecuted as a crime. A political espionage operation can be exposed as an abuse. But a cover-up reaches into the systems meant to discover the truth. It tests law enforcement, presidential authority, campaign finance, legal ethics, and the willingness of officials to tell the truth under oath. It asks whether the machinery of government will be used to investigate misconduct or to contain it. Dean's testimony sharpened that test. The effect on the hearings was immediate in atmosphere, even if the legal consequences still had to unfold. The committee was no longer listening only for names connected to the Watergate operation. It was listening for a chain of presidential knowledge and approval. Every meeting mattered. Every phrase might matter. Every denial could become significant later. Watergate had entered the zone where memory, loyalty, and documentary evidence would collide. And still, at this point, testimony remained testimony. However powerful Dean's words were, they came from a witness whose account would be challenged, weighed, and compared against others. The country was hearing a grave accusation, but an accusation still had to be tested. That need for testing became one of the defining pressures of the inquiry. If the president and his former counsel gave different accounts of what happened inside the White House, then the investigation needed something more reliable than recollection alone. The Senate hearings had made the scandal public. John Dean's testimony made it presidential. But his account also raised a practical question that would soon become unavoidable. Was there any record inside the White House that could confirm or contradict what witnesses were saying? The answer would come from another aide, and it would transform the inquiry again. Watergate had moved from a taped door to seized evidence to campaign links to public testimony about the president. Now the investigation was approaching something even more consequential than a witness's memory. It was approaching the possibility that the presidency had been recording itself. By the end of John Dean's testimony, Watergate had become a contest over the inside of the White House. Not the public rooms seen in photographs, not the East Room ceremonies, not the statements issued for cameras, but the private working spaces where aides spoke to the president, where explanations were shaped, and where decisions were made before they were defended. Dean had offered one account. President Richard Nixon and his defenders had reasons to resist it. The Senate Watergate Committee now faced a problem familiar to investigators, but rare at this level of government. When the most important conversations happened behind closed doors, how could the public know which version was true? The answer did not arrive as a dramatic confession. It came through another witness, Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide. His importance was not that he had been one of the burglars or one of the men arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices or one of the campaign figures tied to the early criminal case. Butterfield's importance was quieter. He had worked close enough to the machinery of the Nixon White House to know something about how the presidency recorded itself. When Butterfield testified, he revealed that President Nixon maintained a voice-activated tape recording system in several White House rooms. It was a sentence that changed the investigation. Until that moment, Watergate had been built from many kinds of evidence. There had been the physical evidence of the break-in, tape on a door, tools, cash, surveillance equipment, and concealed microphones. There had been police work and FBI alerts. There had been trial exhibits preserved by the National Archives. There had been public testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee, carried into American homes through live television and primetime broadcasts. There had been John Dean's account, naming the president in the cover-up. But Butterfield's revelation introduced a different category of proof. If the system existed, then investigators were no longer dealing only with memories, notes, denials, and interpretations. They were dealing with the possibility of recordings made inside the presidency itself. This was the moment when the mystery became an archive. That phrase matters because Watergate, up to this point, had often moved through fragments. A guard sees tape. Police enter a building. 5 men are arrested. An address book page is found. A campaign link appears. A witness testifies. Another witness contradicts him. Each piece adds pressure, but each piece also leaves room for dispute. What did a conversation mean? Who heard it? Who approved what? Who was present when the plan shifted from political damage control into obstruction? The hidden recording system promised something more exacting. It suggested that some of those questions might have been captured at the moment they were spoken. The mechanism itself was essential to the significance. Butterfield did not describe a president occasionally switching on a recorder for a formal dictation or a ceremonial record. The system he revealed was voice-activated. That meant it could begin recording when voices were present without the visible ritual of someone deciding to make a record. In the context of an investigation already focused on private conversations, that feature carried enormous weight. It meant that the record might include not only polished statements, but working conversations, pauses, interruptions, hesitation, agreement, pressure, and command. For the Senate committee, this changed the nature of the inquiry. A witness could still be questioned. A timeline could still be built. Counsel could still return to dates, meetings, and names. But now, there was a new possibility behind every question. The answer might be checked against a tape. The central question was no longer only, what did John Dean say happened? It became, did the White House recording system capture conversations that could confirm or contradict him? That shift was devastating because it altered the balance between power and evidence. Presidents operate within layers of confidentiality. Aides speak in guarded rooms. Memos move through controlled channels. Public statements are shaped to protect institutional authority. Before Butterfield, that structure made the inner life of the White House difficult to reconstruct. Investigators could press witnesses, but every witness carried the limits of memory and the burden of self-interest. The tapes changed that. They suggested that the closed room might have left its own record. There was also a deeper irony. The same secrecy that had protected presidential conversations may have preserved them. The same system that made discussions invisible to the public made them potentially available as evidence. In an archive report sense, the discovery was almost startlingly literal. Watergate had begun with adhesive tape on a door lock at the Watergate complex. Now the investigation turned toward magnetic tape inside the White House. One kind of tape exposed the break-in. Another kind of tape threatened to expose the response to it. The committee that had been created on February 7, 1973, had been given subpoena power and a mandate to investigate the break-in, the cover-up, and other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct in the 1972 presidential campaign. Butterfield's testimony gave that subpoena power a new target. If the recordings existed, they were not abstract. They were materials. They were objects of evidence, like photographs, address book pages, or hidden microphones, but with a different force. They contained voices. And voices are difficult to paraphrase away. A transcript can be argued over. A witness can say he misunderstood. A participant can claim a conversation was being recalled out of context. But a recording holds tone, timing, and sequence. It can place people in relation to one another. It can show whether an idea was introduced, resisted, accepted, or directed. For Watergate, where the crucial issue had become the cover-up, sequence mattered intensely. What did the president know and when? What did H.R. Haldeman convey? What role did John Ehrlichman, John N. Mitchell, John W. Dean III, and others play in shaping the response? What pressure reached L. Patrick Gray and the FBI? What was said privately while public denials continued? Butterfield's revelation did not answer those questions by itself. It opened the vault in which the answers might exist. That is why this point in the story feels quieter than the break-in, but more dangerous. No police entered a dark office. No guard found tape on a lock. No burglars were discovered with equipment in the middle of the night. Instead, a former aide told the committee that a recording system had been operating inside several White House rooms. The drama was procedural, but the consequence was enormous. From that point forward, every denial had to live in the shadow of the tapes. For President Nixon, the existence of the recordings created a legal and political crisis that could not easily be managed through public messaging. If the tapes supported him, they could discredit his accusers. If they contradicted him, they could do what no witness alone could do: place the president's own words into the evidentiary record. That made the recordings both potentially exculpatory and potentially catastrophic. The investigation had now moved beyond the question of whether the Senate could hear testimony. It was moving toward whether the presidency could be compelled to surrender its own internal record. That issue would eventually pull prosecutors, the courts, and the White House into direct conflict. Key prosecutors connected to the tape fight included Archibald Cox and later Leon Jaworski. The dispute would reach the Supreme Court in United States v. Nixon, where the justices would decide whether subpoenaed presidential tape recordings and documents had to be produced for a criminal proceeding, despite a broad claim of executive privilege. But at the moment of Butterfield's revelation, the full legal battle was still ahead. What mattered first was recognition. The committee, the press, prosecutors, and the public now understood that Watergate might not have to depend on competing narratives forever. Somewhere inside the White House recording system, there could be a contemporaneous account of the very conversations at the center of the scandal. In that sense, Butterfield did not simply disclose a technical system. He changed the logic of proof. The hearings had already turned the scandal into a national listening experience. Americans had heard questions, answers, evasions, and sworn recollections. Butterfield revealed that there was another listening device in the story, one that had been present before the hearings, before the public broadcasts, and before the country knew what it needed to hear. The White House itself had been listening. And if the system had recorded the right conversations, then Watergate would no longer be a struggle to reconstruct the past from memory. It would become a struggle over access to the past as it had been preserved. That is the threshold this chapter reaches. The investigation began with an office complex near the Potomac River and the Kennedy Center. It moved through arrests, campaign links, Senate subpoenas, and televised testimony. Now it had arrived at a hidden archive of presidential speech. Inside that archive was a recording from June 23, 1972, only days after the break-in. On it, according to the Nixon Library's description, President Nixon and H.R. Haldeman discussed having the CIA ask the FBI to halt or limit the Watergate investigation by claiming a national security reason. Once the existence of the tapes was known, that conversation could no longer remain only a possibility behind closed doors. It was becoming evidence. The hidden recording system changed the shape of Watergate because it introduced a different kind of witness. People could forget. People could shade their recollections. People could deny qualify, or reinterpret. But a tape, if it could be obtained and authenticated, carried the sound of a moment before the country knew to ask about it. That is why the recording from June 23, 1972, became so important. It was made in the Oval Office only 6 days after the break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices inside the Watergate complex. At that point, the burglary was still close to its beginning. The arrests were fresh. The public story was still forming. The chain from the men caught inside the sixth-floor offices to the president's re-election operation had begun to matter, but the full constitutional crisis had not yet taken shape. The Nixon Library describes this recording as the smoking gun conversation. The name is stark, and it has endured because the tape seemed to answer one of the central questions that had followed Watergate from the first days of the investigation: whether President Richard Nixon himself was connected to an effort to obstruct or contain the inquiry into the break-in. On that tape, Nixon and H.R. Haldeman discussed having the CIA ask the FBI to halt or limit the Watergate investigation by claiming a national security reason. The mechanism mattered. This was not simply a conversation about public relations or political embarrassment or how to explain the arrests. It involved the use of one government agency to affect the work of another. The FBI was investigating the Watergate burglary. The proposed pressure point was the CIA. The stated pretext was national security. In the language of a scandal, cover-up can become a broad word. It can refer to silence, denials, payments, misdirection, or pressure on witnesses. But this conversation gave investigators something more specific to examine. It showed a discussion about a method. The CIA would be asked to intervene with the FBI. The reason offered would be that the investigation was touching sensitive national security ground. The practical effect would be to halt or limit the inquiry. What made the recording so damaging was its timing. June 23rd was not a distant moment after months of panic and exposure. It came less than a week after the break-in. The doors at the Watergate complex had been taped in the early hours of June 17th. Frank Wills had noticed the tape, removed it, later saw that it had reappeared, and called police. 5 men had been arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices. Within that first day, the FBI had been alerted, and Acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray had been notified by teletype that one arrested man was connected to the committee to re-elect the president. By June 23rd, then, the facts were still narrow but dangerous. There had been a crime scene inside a political party's office. There were arrested burglars, including James McCord, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. There were campaign connections already beginning to surface. There were objects that made the burglary look like political intelligence gathering rather than ordinary theft: burglary tools, walkie-talkie equipment, cash, photographs, and concealed microphones. And now, inside the Oval Office, the president and his chief of staff were discussing a way to effect the federal investigation. The power of the tape came from the distance it closed. Before the tapes were known, investigators had testimony, documents, and physical evidence. They had John Dean's claim that Nixon had approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in. They had the public drama of the Senate Watergate Committee, where witnesses could be questioned in front of the country. But there remained a gap between accusation and preserved presidential speech. The June 23rd recording narrowed that gap. It placed the president not at the edge of the story, but inside an early conversation about the investigation's future. The issue was no longer only whether Nixon had later learned of improper conduct by subordinates. It was whether he had participated, days after the burglary, in a plan to use the CIA to restrain the FBI. That distinction mattered, because Watergate had become a test of responsibility within the executive branch itself. The president stood at the top of that branch. The FBI and CIA were not private instruments. They were institutions of government. To discuss using one to limit the other under a claim of national security brought the scandal directly into the question of presidential power. The phrase national security carried weight in the federal government. It could close doors. It could slow questions. It could create deference. In the conversation described by the Nixon Library, that phrase was not merely background language. It was the proposed reason that would be offered to the FBI. The danger was that a legitimate category of government secrecy could be used as a shield for political damage control. This is why the tape has remained central in accounts of Watergate. It did not need to explain every act that followed. It did not need to include every person who would later become part of the investigation. Its importance lay in what it captured at a precise moment: the president and H.R. Haldeman discussing a plan that would interfere with the investigation into the burglary, and doing so almost immediately after the crime. The tape also changed how earlier testimony was heard. John Dean had testified that the president approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in. That testimony was explosive because it turned Watergate from a story about campaign operatives into a story about the president's own conduct. But once Alexander Butterfield revealed the recording system, Dean's testimony no longer stood only as one man's sworn account. There was now the possibility of comparison. What did witnesses say happened? What did the tapes show? Where did memory and recording meet? Where did they diverge? The June 23rd recording became the clearest example of why the hidden system mattered. It showed that the archive inside the White House was not an abstract curiosity. It contained conversations that could bear directly on criminal investigation, congressional inquiry, and the impeachment process. The presidency had preserved, without public knowledge, a record that could test the president's own public position. In the broader Watergate arc, this was the moment when the break-in and the cover-up became inseparable. The burglary at the Watergate complex had supplied the first crime scene. The arrests supplied the first names. The evidence found with the burglars supplied the first signs of political surveillance. The campaign connection supplied the first link to Nixon's re-election operation. The Senate hearing supplied a public forum. Dean supplied a claim about presidential approval of a cover-up. Butterfield supplied the existence of the tapes. But the smoking gun conversation supplied something different: a recorded early discussion involving Nixon himself and a proposed effort to limit the FBI investigation. That did not end the matter by itself. A recording can exist and still be out of reach. Its significance can be known, hinted at, or demanded, while the material remains protected behind claims of presidential confidentiality. Once the tapes became the center of the case, the struggle moved into another arena. Prosecutors would seek access to White House recordings and documents. Nixon would assert a broad claim of executive privilege. The question would become not only what the president had said, but whether a president could withhold subpoenaed evidence from a criminal proceeding. The tape had turned the mystery into an archive. Now the archive would become a constitutional fight. The tape had turned the mystery into an archive. Now the archive would become a constitutional fight. For investigators, the discovery of the White House recording system changed the practical question at the center of Watergate. It was no longer only a matter of interviewing witnesses, comparing public statements, or tracing money and campaign connections outward from the break-in. If conversations inside the presidency had been recorded, then the investigation had a possible way to test memory against sound. It could compare testimony with the president's own recorded words. It could ask not only what people said had happened, but what the microphones in the White House had captured at the time. That possibility made the tapes more than historical material. They were potential evidence. The criminal investigation needed evidence. That is the plain legal problem underneath the larger drama. 5 men had been arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate office complex. Trial defendants and associated figures had included G. Gordon Liddy, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, E. Howard Hunt, James McCord, Bernard Barker, and Virgilio Gonzalez. The early physical evidence had pointed beyond an ordinary burglary. Burglary tools, walkie-talkie equipment, cash, photographs, an address book page, and concealed microphones. Then the investigation had moved toward campaign connections, obstruction, and the conduct of men around the president. But recordings, if they existed and if they could be obtained, might answer questions that no witness could settle alone. They might show how the White House responded after the break-in. They might confirm or contradict John Dean's testimony that President Nixon had approved plans to cover up White House connections to the burglary. They might reveal whether the language of public denial matched the private language of the Oval Office. That is why the tape fight became so intense. It was not a side issue. It was the place where the criminal investigation and the presidency collided. Archibald Cox was one of the key prosecutors connected to the fight for the tapes. His role placed him at the center of a difficult demand to seek White House recordings and documents that the president did not want to turn over. The demand was narrow in one sense, because it concerned specific material thought to be relevant to a criminal proceeding. But it was enormous in constitutional meaning because it reached into the president's confidential communications. Nixon's answer was executive privilege. The phrase can sound abstract, but in Watergate, it had a very concrete meaning. The president argued that White House conversations and materials deserved protection from disclosure. The claim rested on the idea that a president must be able to receive advice, discuss decisions, and conduct the work of the office with a measure of confidentiality. Without that protection, the argument went, presidential deliberation could be chilled, distorted, or exposed before it was ready for public judgment. There was a real institutional issue there. The presidency is not only one person. It is an office, a branch of government, and a center of national decision-making. Confidentiality can matter in that setting. But Watergate forced a harder question. How far could that confidentiality extend when a criminal investigation sought evidence? The recordings were not being requested as a matter of curiosity. They were sought because they might bear on whether crimes had been committed, whether evidence had been concealed, and whether the machinery of government had been used to obstruct an investigation. The issue was not simply whether the public had a right to hear the president's conversations. It was whether a court in a criminal proceeding could require production of subpoenaed presidential tape, recordings, and documents. That distinction matters. Watergate was many things at once: a political scandal, a televised Senate investigation, a constitutional crisis, and a criminal case. The Senate Watergate Committee had brought the story into American homes, with Chairman Sam Ervin, Vice Chairman Howard Baker, and Chief Counsel Samuel Dash pressing witnesses in public hearings. Those hearings gave the country a shared record of testimony. They also created pressure, because once Alexander Butterfield revealed the taping system, every statement about the president's knowledge could be measured against the possibility of recorded proof. But prosecutors were working in a different arena. Their task was not to stage a national inquiry. Their task was to obtain admissible evidence for criminal proceedings. That made the tapes not only politically explosive, but legally necessary. After Archibald Cox, Leon Jaworski became another key prosecutor connected to the tape fight. The names marked continuity in the prosecution's central demand. The investigation still needed White House materials. The existence of the recordings still mattered because the tapes could do what testimony could not: preserve the tone, sequence, and substance of conversations as they happened. The prosecutor's position remained rooted in the needs of criminal justice. If evidence was relevant, subpoenaed, and necessary to a criminal proceeding, then the president's broad claim of privilege could not be allowed to end the inquiry by itself. Nixon's position was equally consequential. If the president could withhold the materials simply by invoking executive privilege, then the recordings might remain sealed from the very proceeding in which they were most needed. A president could, in effect, decide that evidence held within the White House was beyond compulsory reach. In an ordinary case, a subpoena is a demand backed by the authority of the court. In Watergate, that authority met the claim that the president's office carried its own shield. The confrontation was quiet in its legal form, but severe in its implications. On one side stood the need of the criminal process to obtain evidence. On the other stood the president's claim that confidentiality within the executive branch deserved broad protection. Both sides spoke the language of constitutional structure. The prosecutors were not asking merely for a political concession. Nixon was not merely making a public relations argument. The dispute reached the boundary between branches of government. The tapes themselves made that boundary impossible to avoid. If the recordings had never existed, Watergate might have remained a contest of testimony, documents, money trails, and public credibility. But the voice-activated system had created an archive inside the presidency. Once that archive was known, it could not be treated as if it were irrelevant. The president's own recorded conversations became the most sought-after evidence in the case. The June 23, 1972 recording, later described by the Nixon Library as the smoking gun conversation, showed why. In that Oval Office discussion, Nixon and H.R. Haldeman discussed having the CIA ask the FBI to halt or limit the Watergate investigation by claiming a national security reason. That was not a vague recollection from years later. It was a recorded conversation from only days after the break-in. Its existence made the tape archive central to understanding not just what happened, but when the president became involved in efforts to shape the investigation. Still, the country did not yet have the final legal answer. A prosecutor could demand. A president could refuse. A subpoena could issue. A privilege could be asserted. The conflict had to be resolved somewhere above the daily struggle between investigators and the White House. That is where Watergate moved from scandal into constitutional law. The question narrowed and hardened. Could President Richard Nixon withhold subpoenaed tape recordings and documents needed for a criminal proceeding by making a broad claim of executive privilege? Or did the requirements of justice place a limit on presidential confidentiality? By the summer of 1974, that question was no longer theoretical. It stood at the center of United States v. Nixon, waiting for the Supreme Court to decide whether the archive inside the White House belonged only to the president, or whether, in a criminal case, even the president could be required to produce evidence. By the summer of 1974, the Watergate story had narrowed to a question that sounded almost simple, but carried the weight of the presidency inside it. A prosecutor had subpoenaed White House tape recordings and documents for use in a criminal proceeding. President Richard Nixon had refused to turn over all of the material, asserting a broad claim of executive privilege. The issue was no longer only what the recordings might reveal. It was whether the president could keep them beyond the reach of a court. That question reached the Supreme Court as United States versus Nixon. On July 24, 1974, the court issued its decision. For a country that had followed the burglary from the taped door at the Watergate complex, through arrests on the 6th floor of the Democratic National Committee offices, through Senate hearings, testimony, and the discovery of the White House recording system, the ruling marked a decisive turn. Watergate had begun as a criminal investigation into men caught inside an office in the middle of the night. It had grown into an inquiry about political espionage, campaign money, obstruction, and presidential conduct. Now it had become a direct test of whether evidence held inside the White House could be required in a criminal case. The president's argument rested on confidentiality. The presidency Nixon's position held required protected communication. A president needed room to speak with advisors, to consider options, and to conduct official business without every conversation being exposed. In ordinary terms, this was not a strange claim. Any functioning executive office depends on some degree of privacy. The question was how far that privacy extended when the material was not being requested for public curiosity, political embarrassment, or historical research, but for a criminal proceeding. That distinction mattered. The subpoenaed materials were not abstract papers sitting in an archive. They were tape recordings and documents connected to the Watergate criminal process. The hidden recording system, revealed by Alexander Butterfield, had changed the nature of the evidence. Witnesses had testified. Former White House counsel John Dean had said that President Nixon approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in. The Nixon Library would later describe the June 23, 1972 tape as the smoking gun conversation, a recording in which Nixon and H.R. Haldeman discussed having the CIA ask the FBI to halt or limit the Watergate investigation by claiming a national security reason. But before the public could fully understand what the tapes contained, the legal system had to decide whether they could be obtained. United States v. Nixon answered that question. The Supreme Court required production of the subpoenaed presidential tape recordings and documents for the criminal proceeding. In doing so, it rejected Nixon's broad claim of executive privilege. The ruling did not say that presidential confidentiality had no value. Its importance was more precise and more powerful because of that precision. The court recognized that there could be limits to disclosure in some circumstances, but it refused to accept the idea that a general claim of executive privilege could automatically block evidence needed in a criminal case. That was the defining line. A president could not simply place relevant subpoenaed evidence outside the reach of justice by invoking the office of the presidency. The White House was not converted into a sealed vault merely because the materials inside it were presidential materials. The court's decision made clear that the needs of a criminal proceeding could outweigh a broad assertion of confidentiality. In the Watergate timeline, that meant the fight for the tapes had reached its legal end. The question of access had been answered at the highest level. There is a quiet force in that moment. No dramatic raid, no midnight arrest, no televised confrontation in a hearing room. The decision came in the language of law, but it struck at the center of the crisis. For more than 2 years, Watergate had moved through institutions, the Metropolitan Police responding to Frank Wills's call, the FBI being alerted on the day of the break-in, the Senate creating the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, prosecutors pursuing evidence, and the House Judiciary Committee examining grounds for impeachment. Each institution had carried the story further from the original office burglary and closer to the presidency. The Supreme Court's role was different. It did not investigate the break-in. It did not decide impeachment. It did not judge the president's political future. It resolved a constitutional conflict over evidence. But that conflict was the narrow place through which the rest of the scandal had to pass. Without access to the recordings and documents, the country would remain trapped between sworn testimony, presidential denial, and unresolved suspicion. With access, the evidence could be tested directly. That is why the ruling was so decisive. The tapes had already become the symbol of Watergate's central question: what had been said when officials believed no public audience was listening? But symbols do not convict, clarify, or expose on their own. They must be produced. They must be heard. They must be compared against claims made in public and under oath. United States v. Nixon transformed the tapes from contested presidential property into evidence that had to be surrendered for a criminal proceeding. The decision also set a boundary around presidential power at the very moment when that boundary mattered most. Nixon's claim, if accepted broadly, would have meant that a president could withhold subpoenaed evidence from a criminal case by asserting a general need for confidentiality. The court rejected that position. The presidency remained powerful, but not absolute. Executive privilege existed within a constitutional system, not above it. For Watergate, the timing was severe. The Senate committee's final report had been submitted on June 27, 1974. By then, the scandal had already drawn in the names of Richard Nixon, H.R. Haldeman, John W. Dean III, John Ehrlichman, John N. Mitchell, Alexander Butterfield, L. Patrick Gray, and others connected through testimony, records, and investigation. Public trust had been battered by months of hearings and disclosures. Yet the central archive of presidential speech still remained partly withheld. On July 24th, the Supreme Court removed that barrier. The ruling did not end Watergate by itself. It did something more specific. It forced the next stage into motion. Once the president complied with the decision, the content of the recordings could no longer be held at the edge of the case. According to the United States Senate's history of the investigation, the recordings showed that Nixon had participated in devising a plan to cover up the White House connection to the Watergate burglary. That finding would carry the story into its final political phase. The burglary had begun with tape on a door. The presidency was now being judged by tape of another kind, recordings made inside the White House, preserved by a system installed for presidential use and ordered into a criminal proceeding by the Supreme Court of the United States. In the end, United States v. Nixon did not make the Watergate tapes important. They were already important. It made them reachable. It affirmed that the search for evidence in a criminal case could penetrate even the guarded space of presidential confidentiality. And once that happened, the scandal moved from accusation toward recorded proof, leaving the House Judiciary Committee to confront what the evidence now showed. The Supreme Court had made the recordings reachable. That was the legal turning point. But the next stage of Watergate was political, and it moved through a different chamber of government. Once President Richard Nixon complied with the ruling in United States v. Nixon, the evidence no longer rested only on testimony, inference, or the recollections of former aides. The recordings themselves could be compared against the claims that had been made for more than 2 years. According to the U.S. Senate's history of the investigation, after Nixon complied with the Supreme Court ruling, the recordings showed that he had participated in devising a plan to cover up the White House connection to the Watergate burglary. That sentence is the hinge of the story. For much of Watergate, the central question had been whether the burglary could be traced upward. The 5 men arrested inside the Democratic National Committee offices had been a beginning, not an explanation. The early connection to the committee to re-elect the president had made the crime politically dangerous. The Senate Watergate Committee had given the investigation a national stage. John Dean had testified that Nixon approved plans to cover up White House connections to the break-in. Alexander Butterfield had revealed that a White House recording system existed. Prosecutors had fought to obtain the tapes. The Supreme Court had rejected Nixon's broad claim of executive privilege in a criminal proceeding. Each stage narrowed the distance between suspicion and evidence. But the release of the recordings after the court's decision changed the quality of that evidence. The country was no longer being asked only to weigh the credibility of one witness against another. It was being confronted with the presidency's own preserved record. The archive that had once been hidden inside the White House now spoke directly to the issue that had defined the scandal from the beginning, not merely who had broken into the Watergate offices, but who had tried to stop the investigation from exposing the White House connection. The House Judiciary Committee was already in the center of its impeachment inquiry. By the time the tapes were produced, the committee had been examining whether the conduct revealed by Watergate had crossed the constitutional line from political scandal into impeachable conduct. The Supreme Court ruling did not create that question. It sharpened it. It placed before Congress evidence that carried a different force because it came from recordings made inside the presidency itself. The committee's work belonged to the constitutional process, not to a criminal trial. Prosecutors were pursuing evidence for criminal proceedings. The Senate had conducted a broad public investigation into the break-in, the cover-up, and other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct connected to the 1972 presidential campaign. The House now faced the question of impeachment, whether a president's actions warranted formal charges before the full House, and, if approved there, possible trial in the Senate. Watergate had moved through institutions in sequence. First, police responded to a call from a night security guard at the Watergate office complex. Then, the FBI was alerted. Then prosecutors and grand juries followed the criminal case. Then the Senate created a select committee with subpoena power and a public mandate. Then the courts addressed the demand for White House recordings and documents. Now the House Judiciary Committee had to decide how the record applied to the president himself. The committee adopted 3 articles of impeachment before the full House voted. That fact marks one of the most consequential moments in the Watergate timeline. It means the scandal had reached the stage where members of the House Judiciary Committee concluded that formal impeachment charges should move forward. The full House had not yet acted. Nixon had not yet resigned. But the constitutional machinery was no longer theoretical. It was in motion. The significance was not only procedural, it was political. For months, Nixon's position had depended on uncertainty. He could deny direct involvement. He could challenge testimony. He could invoke confidentiality around presidential conversations. He could argue that certain materials belonged within the protected sphere of the executive branch. But after United States v. Nixon, and after compliance with the ruling, the evidence shifted. The recordings showed participation in devising a plan to cover up the White House connection to the burglary. The ground under the presidency changed. In an archive report view of the story, this is where Watergate becomes stark. The original break-in had been physical and small in scale. Taped locks, offices entered after midnight, men arrested inside a political party's headquarters, equipment and cash, and hidden microphones. The cover-up was larger, more difficult to see, and more dependent on power. It involved decisions about how to contain an investigation, how to manage exposure, and how to protect the White House from the consequences of a crime committed during a presidential campaign. The tapes joined those two worlds. They connected the quiet, mechanical fact of the burglary to conversations at the highest level of government. The same scandal that began with a door that would not stay locked had become a record of presidential discussion. That is why the evidence mattered so deeply. It did not merely embarrass the administration. It undercut the distance that had been maintained between the president and the cover-up threat. The House Judiciary Committee's adoption of 3 articles of impeachment showed that the evidence had become politically actionable. Impeachment is not a finding by a court. It is a constitutional judgment made by Congress. In this case, the committee's action reflected the accumulation of evidence from multiple sources: criminal investigation, Senate testimony, subpoenaed material, and finally, the recordings that the Supreme Court required Nixon to produce. The order of events matters. The committee acted before the full House voted. That means the country was suspended between stages. The evidence had been reviewed by a key congressional committee. Articles had been adopted. The next step would have been the full House, but the political support around Nixon was already collapsing under the weight of the recorded proof. Watergate had always involved 2 kinds of accountability. One was legal: arrests, charges, subpoenas, claims of privilege, court orders. The other was political: public trust, congressional support, and the ability of a president to continue governing after the evidence became known. The Supreme Court ruling forced the production of evidence, but it did not by itself remove a president. The House Judiciary Committee's impeachment articles did not by themselves remove a president either. Together, however, they showed that the system was pressing inward from several directions at once. The presidency was now caught between the archive and the Constitution. The archive supplied the record. The Constitution supplied the process. The recording showed what had been said. The House Judiciary Committee translated that record into articles of impeachment. The full House had not yet taken its vote, but the direction of the crisis was clear. For Nixon, the most damaging change was that Watergate no longer depended on whether Americans believed John Dean or H.R. Haldeman or any single official. It no longer depended on whether investigators could reconstruct intent from fragments. The recordings, preserved by the White House system and produced after the Supreme Court's decision, had made the president's own participation part of the documented record. That was the final collapse of plausible separation. The burglary had been carried out by men inside the Democratic National Committee offices. The cover-up had spread outward through campaign and White House circles. For a long time, the central public question was how far upward the effort had gone. After the tapes were turned over, the answer was no longer only an allegation. According to the Senate's history of the investigation, the recording showed that Nixon had participated in devising a plan to cover up the White House connection to the Watergate burglary. By late summer of 1974, the scandal had reached the edge of an even more dramatic moment. The House Judiciary Committee had adopted 3 articles of impeachment. The presidency had lost the protection of uncertainty. What remained was a decision by Richard Nixon himself, made under the pressure of evidence, Congress, and a constitutional process that had moved steadily from a taped door in Washington, D.C. toward the possible removal of a president. By late summer of 1974, the Watergate investigation had reached a point where silence could no longer hold the presidency together. The House Judiciary Committee had adopted 3 articles of impeachment. The Supreme Court had required the production of subpoenaed recordings and documents. The tapes had moved from rumor to legal evidence to political force. And Richard Nixon, who had won re-election less than 2 years earlier, now faced a constitutional process that was closing around him. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Nixon spoke to the country in a national address. It was not the first time Americans had heard him discuss Watergate. But this time, the purpose was different. He was not explaining a legal position, defending executive privilege, or promising cooperation with an investigation. He was announcing that he intended to resign the presidency. The moment was both formal and deeply personal in its setting. A president addressed the public from within the institution that had been at the center of the crisis. The White House had been the place where aides met, where decisions were made, where the voice-activated recording system captured conversations that later became evidence. Now, it was also the place from which Nixon acknowledged that his presidency could not continue. The resignation address mattered because it marked the end of the impeachment struggle before the full House and Senate completed it. The House Judiciary Committee had acted, but the full House had not yet voted on impeachment. The Senate had not held a trial. Nixon's resignation prevented that final constitutional sequence from unfolding. Yet, it did not erase what had already happened. A burglary investigation had led to Senate hearings, criminal proceedings, a Supreme Court decision, and articles of impeachment. The pressure came from several parts of the American system at once: investigators, courts, Congress, the press, witnesses, prosecutors, and the documentary record preserved on tape. The next day, August 9, 1974, Nixon's resignation became official. The written act was spare compared with the scale of the scandal. His resignation letter was addressed to Secretary of State Henry A. Kissinger and dated August 9, 1974. In constitutional terms, that letter carried the force that the televised address had anticipated. It ended Nixon's presidency. At noon that same day, Vice President Gerald Ford became president. The swearing-in took place in the East Room of the White House. The setting mattered. It was not a campaign stage or a courthouse. It was the executive mansion itself, the same institution whose powers and boundaries had been tested throughout Watergate. The transfer of power happened inside the constitutional order, not outside it. The presidency continued, even as one president left office under the weight of scandal. Ford inherited more than an office. He inherited the unresolved meaning of Watergate. Nixon was no longer president, but the country still faced questions about accountability, criminal exposure, public trust, and whether resignation was an ending or only a pause before further legal consequences. The scandal had damaged confidence not only in particular officials, but in the idea that the presidency could be trusted to police itself when its own survival was at stake. That question became sharper 1 month later. On September 8, 1974, President Gerald Ford issued a pardon proclamation for Richard Nixon. The language was broad. Ford granted Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for offenses against the United States committed or possibly committed between January 20th, 1969 and August 9th, 1974. Those dates were not incidental. They covered Nixon's presidency from the day it began to the day it ended. The pardon did not name only a single act, a single conversation, or a single charge. It reached across the full span of possible federal offenses committed or possibly committed while Nixon held office. In practical terms, it ended Nixon's federal criminal exposure for that period. In public terms, it opened a new controversy. Ford presented the pardon as an act meant to move the country beyond the crisis. But for many Americans, the pardon raised the very question Watergate had forced into the open. How should a constitutional democracy balance stability with accountability? If the president could be compelled by the Supreme Court to produce evidence in a criminal proceeding, if congressional investigators could uncover misconduct, if impeachment could move forward, what did it mean for the next president to remove the possibility of federal prosecution for the former one? The pardon became part of Watergate's aftermath because it did not simply close a legal file. It shaped the memory of the scandal. For some, it was an attempt to end a national ordeal. For others, it looked like an unfinished reckoning. The phrase full, free, and absolute carried a finality that many people were not ready to accept. The burglary had been small in its physical beginning. Tape on a door, men inside an office, tools, cash, communications equipment, and concealed microphones. But the consequences had become too large to be contained by a single resignation. To understand why the ending remained unsettled, it helps to return to the beginning of the trail. In the early hours of June 17, 1972, Frank Wills was working security at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. He noticed tape on a door lock, removed it, and later saw that tape had appeared again. That observation led him to call police. Officers entered the building and arrested 5 men inside the Democratic National Committee offices, identified in Washington Post reporting as being on the 6th floor. What first appeared to be a burglary became a question about political surveillance. Then it became a question about campaign connections. Then obstruction. Then secret recordings. Then executive privilege. Then impeachment. Then resignation. Then pardon. Watergate's power as a story comes from that chain. It did not begin with a formal accusation against a president. It began with a physical clue in a building near the Potomac River. The evidence widened step by step. The burglar's equipment suggested more than ordinary theft. The early link to the committee to re-elect the president made the crime politically explosive. The Senate Watergate Committee turned the investigation into a public national proceeding. John Dean's testimony raised the stakes inside the White House. Alexander Butterfield's disclosure of the recording system changed the nature of proof. The June 23, 1972 tape, described by the Nixon Library as the smoking gun conversation, placed the president in a discussion about having the CIA ask the FBI to halt or limit the Watergate investigation by claiming a national security reason. United States v. Nixon made clear that a broad claim of executive privilege could not keep subpoenaed evidence from a criminal proceeding. And after the tapes were produced, the political support necessary to survive impeachment collapsed. The meaning of Watergate, then, is not only that a president resigned. It is that a system of accountability, strained and imperfect, continued to operate under pressure. A night guard made an observation. Police responded. Journalists reported. Investigators followed records. Witnesses testified. Senators held public hearings. Prosecutors sought evidence. The Supreme Court ruled. Members of the House Judiciary Committee voted on articles of impeachment. Each step depended on someone treating a detail as worth pursuing. But Watergate also left behind a warning. Institutions did not move automatically. Evidence had to be found, protected, demanded, and interpreted. Testimony had to be challenged. Claims of power had to be tested. The presidency had to be treated not as a place beyond law, but as an office inside a constitutional structure. That is why the taped door still matters. It reminds us that constitutional crises do not always announce themselves at the beginning. Sometimes they begin as something small enough to miss, a strip of tape where it should not be, a lock that does not catch, a guard who looks twice. From there, the path led to the Oval Office, to the Supreme Court, to the House Judiciary Committee, to a resignation letter addressed to Henry A. Kissinger, and finally, to a pardon signed by Gerald Ford. Watergate did not answer every question about presidential power. It did not remove future conflict between secrecy and accountability. It did not settle, for all time, how a nation should recover after official wrongdoing. But it did show that a burglary investigation could expose a struggle over the limits of the highest office in the United States. And in the end, the scandal's deepest lesson may be found in its scale. A small act of detection opened a national inquiry. A door that would not stay locked led to a president who could not remain in office.